I hope you guys are breathing for today's podcast. Today's guest is Brian MacKenzie. He is a human performance expert, educator, author, and public speaker. He is an elite performance coach with 2 decades of experience innovating new protocols for training for Olympians, professional athletes, and the everyday people like us. I came across Brian when I picked up a copy of his book, Unbreakable Runner, which was written by him and TJ Murphy. And it really got me thinking about how I'm training. And I've kind of made some changes with regard to my training over the last year, sort of willy-nilly, but this sort of honed it in as an alternative. Now, it's not, the only way to do things, but very interesting alternative way to look at endurance training. He also is the founder of The Art of Breath, which is a division of Power Speed Endurance, and they have amazing programs that incorporates not only endurance training, but your breath, your nutrition, everything into this whole idea of being a human performance elite, like to be the best you that you can be. So I hope you all enjoy this episode with Brian MacKenzie and take a deep breath because you need it. You need those deep breaths through your nose and not your mouth. Fellow mouth breathers. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Same 24 Hours podcast with Meredith Atwood. We all have the same 24 hours each day, and it's what we do with those hours that makes all the difference between our health, happiness, and success.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Same 24 Hours podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Atwood. Today's guest is Brian MacKenzie. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Meredith.
How are you?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Really excited to talk to you. So I picked up your book, Unbreakable Runner, about a month ago, and I've been doing CrossFit for about a year, and I found myself just kind of nodding along, like, yes, this is it. This is amazing. And so I want to talk to you about it and also talk to you about, really, it's just about me.
I get it.
Yeah.
You're just using this platform in order to talk.
Exactly.
I get it.
No, just
I get
kidding.
it.
But super great book. So thank you, first of all, for writing it. I guess it's been out a couple years, but I just found it. So let's start there and see where we go. So Unbreakable Runner. Let's get a little background on you.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I have to thank a guy who I actually haven't had a conversation with in quite some time. His name's TJ Murphy, and he was the former senior editor of Triathlete Magazine and a bunch of the publications sitting under Competitor Group. And he was somebody who had who had done things one way. And he heard about this guy who was doing these radical things, and he challenged it, and we actually got into an altercation online about this.
I love online altercations, don't you?
And yeah, I used to. I'm like, this is just the weirdest thing ever. Like, it's just weird that we socialize now on this, or whatever we're doing online. Anyway, he ended up coming and coming to a seminar I was teaching in San Diego, and he literally stumbled in because he was like crippled. And I was like, hey, so this is what's going on. This is what's going on. And this is amidst me teaching a seminar and on my break. And he's like, what? And he just listened the whole time. And we ended up forging a friendship. And he was like, we got to write another book. Because like this just changed the way he started looking at things. And we were able to open that up. And I think for me, it was the same story as well. I was a short course sprinter, and mostly I grew up I was a skate punk. I was a surfer. I grew up in Southern California. I had a background in swimming and playing water polo. I was very speed oriented. I swam the 50 and the 100. And that was all I did. And I got roped into doing a triathlon in like 2001, and I ended up doing one and getting crushed on the bike and the run. And I barely trained and barely did the swim. I barely trained for the swim, and I literally came in the top 10. Mm-hmm. And that's just because I've got a background in it, right? Well, it's really easy for people to look at that and go, well, yeah, you had a background in that. And it's like, well, yeah, I did. I established a base and I started from a foundation. And that thought process has really kind of is what altered everything in the landscape of everything, because I had done some cycling, but I didn't do as terrible as I did on the run. And I did some running, but I hadn't been a runner. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at all these things, and I worked with a number of people in my career who had plenty of influence on what I did, but we inevitably conceived the idea of quality and took it back to looking at things like, well, what is a world-class marathoner? Where does he start or she start? And if you look at world-class, even Ironmanners, they do not start off Ironmanning. They do not start off marathoning, nor do they come close to the mileage that they're actually putting in for those things. And where they start is world-class 3,000 meter or 1,500 meter runners or sprint course triathletes that are very, very fast. And there's a big gap that happens as we see things as it's kind of the general population. We see these things like Ironman as being great things, and don't think that I didn't go through this process, because I did. I did one triathlon. I literally went and signed up for a half Ironman, and after a sprint distance, after getting my butt kicked at a sprint distance, right. I signed up for a half Ironman so that I could actually know that I could go and do a full Ironman, and which I did a full Ironman in 2004. So first triathlon ended up being in 2002, early 2002. And then it literally, I was doing a full Ironman by 2004, and I did one, and I was just I was wrecked. I was literally just destroyed, and I didn't understand it. And I didn't feel like that should have been the case. And so we kind of reworked things, introduced some strength and conditioning. You said you have a did you have a powerlifting or weightlifting?
Olympic lifting. So
okay, so Olympic lifting.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. Well, so I had a bit of a powerlifting background, and my dad, I had a garage gym in 1991 because my dad was doing some powerlifting, and this is where he trained and whatever. And I was following suit back when I was in high school, and we were doing a lot of strength training. Anyway, we took it back and started doing some strength training, but we figured out pretty quickly that you couldn't do a lot of strength training if you were going to run, bike, and swim long. You were just too beat up. You were too sore. Right. So we started manipulating things and playing with things, and that inevitably evolved into what we first launched was CrossFit Endurance. And now we've morphed that or evolved that with what is Power Speed Endurance, which was my first book. And that is where we utilize some of the principles of CrossFit. In the variance and the strength and conditioning aspect of this, the GPP, that is a very important component. I felt that, we saw just tremendous results as by adding that to the conditioning aspect of things. Mm-hmm. And that allowed for people, especially in triathlon, who are terrible at specific sports, to actually make little jumps quicker than they actually normally were, because it's you're transitioning into something else. And so when we start to challenge ourselves metabolically in other things, in other realms or positions or movements that we're not very good at, and when we tend to get better at those things, other things tend to open up. And that's kind of the core, the crux of what is it, the heart of CrossFit and what CrossFit really is, which today most people don't truly understand what CrossFit actually is.
Right. I definitely want to touch on that before we go forward. So, because I can just hear the people, wanting to press off, because there is so many misconceptions of CrossFit. I mean, even still, people say to me, well, you're just going to get hurt. And I mean, even with my lifting background, it's crazy to me. So let's talk about the misconceptions of CrossFit. Or maybe what it is.
Well, simply put, it's not the CrossFit Games.
No, I do not look like that.
Well, it doesn't matter what you look like. It's not the CrossFit Games.
Yeah.
that is not CrossFit. That is the sport of CrossFit. That is a highly, and you've got to be able to differentiate that. You can't sit there and group that in the same thing. So what CrossFit actually is arguably the greatest movement diagnostic tool that we've ever seen. Mm-hmm. You show me if you can't squat with a bar over your head, great. We're going to drop that bar to the front of to a front rack position. And can you squat it there? And can you show me you can squat it well? If you can't, great. We're going to throw it on your back. We'll make it a little easier. Oh, you can't do that either. Look, we're going to take the bar off. That's called scalability. And that's how CrossFit actually works, right? You take something in reverse if you can't do the highly technical or highly skilled or movement, and you back it down. And it's also not Metcons 5 days a week.
Right.
CrossFit actually is, we used to talk about this in our original seminar, that going into the gym and deadlifting 7 sets of 1 is CrossFit. You go home after that. And if you can't go home after deadlifting 7 sets of 1, you don't understand what 7 sets of 1 means.
That's true. Okay.
And so on the flip side of that, the next day shows a 5K run.
Right.
So, right. And these are just examples of what we used to talk about with people. And then you get the crowd that goes, yay, on the 5K run. They won't deadlift, right? But then you get the crowd who just wants to deadlift heavy, who doesn't want to run.
Right.
And so in any aspect, what you get when you have people, you get confusion. Not everybody's a bright star. And people get stuck into, and we all do this. We all get attracted to the things that we do pretty good, or that we want to do the most. And unfortunately, that's not the crux of how CrossFit operates. CrossFit's a constantly varied functional movement at high intensity. High intensity does not mean the same thing for everything. A 5K run is not the same intensity as a 7x1 deadlift or a 7x1 clean. Okay, that is a 1 rep max is a very it's a top end anaerobic phosphagen pathway movement is incredibly demanding on the central nervous system. 5K run could be demanding on the central nervous system if you've never done one, but it's an easier intensity than that is a more aerobic or slow glycolytic type work effort. Right? This is not that is a completely different, dominant energy system. And so being able to understand how that operates and how to move under that is key. And that was where, this is where I meshed with CrossFit really well. And I still do. I think, I still have conversations with Greg from time to time, and it's still, Greg Glassman, who created CrossFit, and he understands this idea. He doesn't not understand this idea. This is why, they're literally pivoting back towards health. Because it's like, look, the games aren't CrossFit, but this is a fun thing that people can do and train for, and it's a great event. And these are the fittest people on the planet. The challenge is out there. Anybody can participate, but that's not actually what CrossFit is, right? And so CrossFit is more or less a constantly varied functional movement, high intensity. And where we fit into that was we were developing high level skill of swim, bike, run, or row. And now even, you're looking at tactical, but we're developing skill through that, where we're doing a lot of skill development, and then we're also adding intensity to that, but it's a varying intensity. So one day you might be doing some short, hard efforts. The next day, in 2 days, you might be doing some longer duration efforts, which are working on more of that kind of lactate or anaerobic side of things. And then another day you're doing strictly some longer aerobic work to push those things. That combined with the program itself of the strength and conditioning aspect, or the GPP aspect, molded results we had never seen before.
Right. So let's talk about most endurance program. So if you're going to do a triathlon or train for a marathon and you go to any traditional coach, they're basically the base of the program is going to be, hey, we're going to spend some time building your aerobic base. And then you just spend all this time in your zone 2 heart rate and miles and miles and miles. And where you deviate, right, is to get away from those junk miles and to have less of the repetitive stress on the body.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because what you're going to see with time spent in something, the more time you spend in something, the more damage or the more work or the more, you're actually doing that you're going to need recovery from. So if I were to do, let's just say a 1 hour run, right? That is going to require more recovery time for an individual than actually going and doing a 1 hour CrossFit class. If done correctly, because you're going to warm up, you're going to do some mobility, you're going to do some dynamic work, you're going to do the actual workout, which will most likely be less than 20 minutes. Okay. Then you're going to cool down versus a straight effort of, yeah, and I get it. Oh yeah, we need to get your heart rate up. You need to get used to using your heart rate at 140. Well, I just put your heart rate up to 190 and I brought it back down to 160 and we hovered at 150 for most of the workout. And then we were down in the 120s and 130s and basically it averaged out to about the same thing, except you're going to recover quicker. So
I can hear people saying, but we have to do these miles.
Do you?
Right. I mean, do you? I don't know. Like, you say no. So how do you not? Like, what are the physiological changes that say no? So what happened the first time you ran 10 kilometers? What was it? You were out of breath, or was it you were sore as hell? Sore as hell. And
you got
still to this day.
Okay. So this is another, this is not an aerobic training issue. This is a tissue, this is a strength and conditioning or even a tissue issue. Your tissue's not holding up.
A tissue issue. I love
it. Yeah. Basically, like you're breaking your body down. Mm-hmm. It's eccentric loading. Okay. You got two ways to do it. You can go out and you can run miles and put in the time and require more recovery, or you can actually do some legitimate strength and conditioning to complement what you're doing, work on the skill of actual running, putting in some high quality work that you're actually running in a good position versus going out and just logging miles. And more than likely what we were seeing was poor positions. People just end up molding to their own mobility and restrictions. And you like, unless you know how to change mechanically or to how to run well mechanically, you're just not going to do it. You're going to need some form of skill training. And based on what I was seeing and what I experienced prior to what we developed, there was really none of that to speak of. Most of the work we were doing with a running workout was pretty much skill development work. Being, some sort of high intensity work because it's hard to, be that coordinated with specific drills at specific, doing at specific speeds, right? Or holding specific cadences at specific speeds. And these were all developed in order to get you to mold to better technique, which ends up allowing you to hold up better. Right. So better posture, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right.
Yeah,
that's a simple. Yeah. Right. And so when we start to use exercises that start to complement a runner, a cyclist, or a swimmer, we end up having them hold up better. We build stronger tissue. You're not going to build a big buff CrossFit, CrossFit Games looking endurance athlete. Some people put on muscle easier than others, but the fact of the matter is it's almost physiologically impossible. If you're putting in more aerobic time than you are actually lifting or hypertrophy time, your body gets rid of what it can't. It needs to. Mm-hmm. It's just not like, sure, you might put on a couple or a few pounds here and there in muscle, but is that a better, is that better or worse for you? And anybody who says that's worse for you does not understand longevity, right?
Health,
So
it's just sustainability,
yes,
right?
exactly. You being weak and with less muscle tissue when you're older is one of the key things to somebody's death. Like there's really three key things that are important. That your VO2 max never drop below 22. Okay. That your leg strength allow you to get up off of a couch, right? And that your grip strength stays strong. Those three variables are literally are the most important variables in somebody's longevity of life.
Wow. I've never heard that.
Yeah. Dr. Andy Galpin brings that up, who's my co-author on Unplugged book, but he talks about that all the time.
And you wouldn't even think, like, once you say it, I'm like, well, yeah, you need to be able to get off the couch and open a jar. I mean, that's like living by yourself 101 at age 90. But how many people do we know well into their 70s who can't do those things?
You got it.
Yeah. Yep. Wow.
But then you see these 100-year-old or not, 90-plus-year-old people who are moving around just fine, moving around.
I can't tell you how many of them pass me on a race course. There they go with 88 on their calf. That's great, Mayor. Good job. Okay, but in traditional training, there's this rule of specificity concept that the way to get better at one thing is to do that one thing over and over and over. How does you've kind of touched on this, but how doing a bunch of different things allows you to get better at one thing?
You're still repeating You're still repeating a sport, but you're just not doing it as frequently when you're still banged up, right? And that's kind of the idea. And try not to take that lightly, because when you first start, playing around with our program, if you've never done any strength and conditioning, you've got to be well aware that you got to go easier than normal. Because you will be sore, things will get difficult. It's not the easy road. We try to explain this to people as much as we could. This is not a hack. I've been featured in 3 of Tim Ferriss's books, one of which was, the 4-Hour Body, which we talked about all of this programming and being able to do ultra marathons on very low mileage, of which I did. But that is not what we're talking about is not the easy road. It's not a hack. It's literally introducing you to the kind of martial arts side of running, biking, and swimming.
I have a quote from your book. Hold on, I've got to find it, because I underlined it. And for a low volume program to be effective, however, it can't be easy.
That's right.
Although less time is required, the time will be spent doing challenging, exhausting work. That's the key, right?
Yes. Well, yeah, you're actually doing real work. And that's the problem, is most of us don't want to do real work.
I also love a part in the book where you say that people that have gone through your program report that their pain tolerance goes through the roof on race day, that they're able to just sustain so much more pain.
Well, yes, but I think the biggest thing that we see is the adaptability or the recoverability of somebody, especially post race. They just aren't crippled like they used to be, and they're returning back to a normal life sooner. If that's not, if that's not an indicator of what we're, of something positive for people, then I don't know what is. I remember vividly being, not being able to walk around, walking like Frankenstein after my Ironman, after the first few ultra marathons I did, and then, it was like, oh, we figured some things out here.
Yeah. Yeah. I told you offline before we started, I did the half Ironman in Augusta just a few weeks ago, and I had not done your complete program, but I've been doing CrossFit, been doing small mileage, and I can't wait to see what I could do. But I noticed a bunch of things with getting just functionally stronger. Number one, I wasn't really doing any swimming. However, my swim was the exact same time as when I was putting in a ton of meters. As I was swimming, I felt very balanced. I was not veering to the right. I have always swam to the right. I looked up and I was going straight for the first time in my life. And I also felt like that swim was so easy, and I was not putting out effort. And now it kind of went downhill from there because I haven't been training properly at all for that race. However, the next day I was fine. And so that part that you're talking about, feeling recovered, it was a totally different ball game, even though I have been training completely different. I mean, I felt the best I ever had. Yeah, my time was, 40 minutes slower. So what? I'm back at CrossFit this week, and it was 10 days ago, So yeah, it was pretty remarkable.
Well, that's great. Yeah. And I think that when people really start to, I mean, I've worked with a couple professional triathletes. There's a guy who's followed our stuff for years who's literally, I think he's 40 and he still kills it. But it's not like that. That's a different ball game. When you've achieved professional level in something, you've showed adaptability through things over time that allows you to actually put in volume because you're actually rebounding from that volume. And if you're not actually getting faster or getting better as you put in more mileage and more time, then there's no real reason to be continuing in that fashion. And this just, kind of goes back to the whole idea of, well, what's a world-class marathoner? Where does his program start? So take a look at somebody like Haile Gebrselassie, right? Who is arguably one of the greatest, endurance athletes of our time. And he not only broke the world record at the marathon when he did, he no longer holds that record, but he's also retired. But he held the half marathon world record prior to that. He held the 10K world record prior to that. And I believe he held the 5K world record prior to that. So look at the time. Look at how that worked. He got really fast at the 5K. Then he got really fast at the 10K. Then he got really fast at half Ironmans, right? Or at half marathons, right? Then he stepped it up to marathons. Mm-hmm. The general population kind of goes in reverse. We see something gnarly and we're like, yes, let's go. I'm going to go do that.
Right. For sure.
Yep.
I had no business doing any of my long distance. I probably still don't. I should.
Well, it's not no business, but look, it's not a no business thing. It's like, hey, these things are out there. Their challenges are out there. I think we just get lost in the idea of, and this is something my wife and I talk about a lot, is, athletes and people get caught in goals a lot, and they think that goals are really the important part. And there's a very, there's something that can go very wrong in that thinking, because it doesn't allow for people when we look, I go do an Ironman. Okay, now what? Right. So go, like Bruce Lee has a great quote that he put out. All goals apart from the means are illusions. Becoming is a denial of being. It's literally denying the process of what it is you're actually doing and just going out and slogging something out to accomplish something versus no, maybe I should look at the process of this and how it works. Yes. Right. That's why the martial arts are so incredible. And they teach something like, we're talking about repeating mileage or repeating time on feet over and over and over again, so that you're taking that concept of one kick done 1,000 times. That's not one kick done 1,000 times. That's going and beating oneself up, to the point of you're no longer taking the same step anymore. If you're not taking the same step, meaning you're starting to deteriorate, you're starting to reinforce bad habits.
Right.
And if you're reinforcing bad habits, the problem with a long, slow distance program is you've reinforced so many bad habits that at 50 or 60, your knee's now going to be replaced.
Exactly. And I think that's what I mean by I had no business, because obviously the long, slow distance, it produces a training effect. You will build your endurance, but
100%.
You can't, but the question is, can you do it and be injury free and not have these bad habits and not develop them? And so I was an adult onset runner. I didn't really run until, 2010, never did my whole life. And then so to be a crappy runner coming out of the gate, because I didn't know how, and then to slog all the way to Ironman without really fixing that and not building the foundational strength. That's what I mean by no business. You know, the goal was there, but I should have just like hung out at the 5K for a little bit.
Well, I mean, this is your story, and you do you. You know, I'm not telling. I don't want people to think. You know, like I used to run around kind of, you know, being like, yeah, probably you don't have any business doing that, right? But that's not the truth. That's not my life. And for me, it was like, I mean, I didn't exactly do that, but I did get pretty fast. And then, you know, I actually got pretty quick for an adult starting to run very early, you know, or very, very late in the game, and started using that speed to actually allow me to go longer, right? Versus I'm just going to go long. And then like what we inevitably see with that is people who are just busted up in 10 years.
Right.
Really busted up.
I mean, I'm not telling, and you're not telling anyone that this is what you should do. It's just an alternative.
No. And look, you can get hurt doing things our way if you're not paying attention, right?
If you're me, you can get hurt walking to the car.
Yes. Well, I mean, I do the same thing sometimes.
Yeah. One of the things that I liked in the book, you said instead of peaking or taking an athlete to 100% and peaking and having them race 1 or 2 events a year, the whole idea behind your program is really keeping the athlete around, was it 90 or 95% of working potential at all times so they can race healthy and have the sustainability all year.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. This isn't a new concept. This is a concept somebody like Louis Simmons with Westside Barbells has been saying for probably 20 or 30 years. You know, he keeps his lifters within 90% year round. And he's doing it by virtue of concepts that are very similar to CrossFit. He uses a conjugate method, which basically is the same concept with weight training as CrossFit. Mm-hmm. It's varying up the exercises, training it differently, but using some maximal efforts and some speed efforts, and then using conditioning in between those things in order to keep the athlete primed and ready to go. But make no mistake, when we lift maximally, you know, that's the hard day.
Yeah. How long does it take to recover from like max lift day?
I mean, if we're truly doing, I mean, for like, look, if you're a professional powerlifter or high level powerlifter, that's a few days.
Yeah.
If you're a triathlete or an endurance athlete, that's probably a day. Mm-hmm. Right? You're not lifting enough load to actually really necessitate the stress that's actually kicking, you know, when you're lifting 800 pounds off the ground, comparatively speaking to 200, right? So there's a variance in there.
Yeah.
And understanding that is critical. You know, stress is stress ultimately. And so training yourself to handle the load of 800 pounds is like, you know, running a marathon at like, you know, 1,000-pound back squat is like basically essentially, and, you know, to some degree, like running the almost 2-hour marathon, right? I don't have that physiological. I never spent the time to do that. That's a career, like to do something like that. You've got to be so fast early on and continue on that process, you know, for a decade plus, you know, maybe even 20 years to do something like that.
So your book, Unbreakable Runner, has training plans anywhere from the 5K to the ultra marathon. Can you give us like a high level summary of like what a marathon training plan or a marathon plan would look like under your coaching?
Sure. I mean, you're probably looking at 4 days a week minimum of strength and conditioning. And then you're looking at 3 days a week of running. And the strength and conditioning is there to complement your issues, the things that are going on with you, right? And to kind of clean those things up, but also complement the running, right? So development of, the hamstrings and the calves and, under the hips continuing to work so that they're not just shutting down when I'm running, being stable, being in a better position. My shoulder range of motion is just as important as my hip range of motion. This is something a runner wouldn't typically think about. But if I've got a shoulder that's immobile, that inevitably screws up the, concentric contraction that's occurring across my body as I land. There's big repercussions for things like that. So the strength and conditioning program is set in there. You're probably going to lift. I would say you're probably lifting heavy once or twice a week, but you're going to be spending a lot of your running time doing drills and skill work, complementing getting you ready for a marathon in essence. And this progresses kind of in a linear fashion where you would see something like, 20 or 30 minutes of skill development work followed by, 6 to 8 200-meter repeats. And you should be holding those repeats on a specific time, on a specific cadence. So you're maintaining that skill that we're actually looking to reinforce. And that would a workout like that would progress into something like probably 8 400s, down the road. And then you've got more of your middle distance work where you're looking at 800s to 1 mile repeats, with skill development work in front of that. And that would be very similar in that fashion, progressing from 800s or the kind of 3-minute mark up to, you're looking at 6, 7, 8 minutes sometimes with some people. And then you're looking at some longer duration, a longer duration run where you're looking at progressing something from 5 kilometers all the way up to maybe about a half marathon, usually about a half marathon. And that's about it. But always never, it's kind of fluctuating to where we may do a 10-mile run one week, but then you come back and you do a 5K the next week, but you're running that 5K at, an all-out pace. Like how fast can you run that? And that then comes back to a 10-mile run the next week, which is about 80% effort. And so you're seeing a major drop in intensity in that 10K, right? But you've developed speed on the back end the week before. And so we're kind of kicking back into, settle the body back in and not beat it up as much. And there's a lot of progressions in there, but, that's kind of the gist of what you would kind of see with what we were doing.
So what would be the longest run? I mean, assuming the person is doing what they're supposed to be doing, with the strength training and the drills, what would typically be your longest run?
Typically you're looking at, for a marathon, half marathon.
Okay.
Typically. Some people start to freak out a little too much, so we let them go out and run 18, 20 miles and ask them how they felt afterwards, and they feel fine, and they're like, oh, I guess I can do this. So would that same principle apply for ultra? I mean, is it basically 50% less mileage? Yeah. No.
Okay.
There's no real need to be running really anything outside. Look, past 10 kilometers really of running, like you're not seeing a whole lot of VO2 change. So there's no real necessity in being out there other than getting the tissue prepared. So if we're actually getting tissue prepared and doing things, like some of the longest stuff we see with training wise with people is really in the half marathon distance or multiple 5Ks repeated. So something like 4x5K, right? So you'd run 4 5Ks with like 5 to 10 minutes rest between them, but you'd be holding on them on a specific pace. And these sort of things will have you more or less prepared for an ultra marathon. You also got to look at ultra marathoning is if I'm signing up to go do 100 miles, I probably needed to qualify for that. So you're going to have to do a 50 miler to qualify, right? And then you probably did a 50K before. So you've got some racing in there. And so racing becomes kind of the experience. of this thing and understanding your body and how you can transition. So that plays a part in it. But I mean, the longest runs I did going into the 200 milers I did was half marathon.
If you're at a half marathon distance, say you've done a half marathon and you did reasonably well and you recovered well, what kind of time frame are you looking at to kind of make the adaptations to do a marathon with this training? Or is that just dependent on who you are? I mean,
it just depends on what you want to do. I mean, I think that comes into what you want to do as a person. Okay. If you've run a half marathon, there's no reason why you can't run a marathon. Mm-hmm. You just need to be well aware that, the training is probably going to be a little more intense or a little bit more, there's going to be a little bit more of it. And there are differences between, looking at a half marathon versus a marathon versus, a marathon training program does not differentiate too much from an ultra marathon training program.
Okay. What about the mental shift? I mean, if you're someone who's done a lot of long, slow distance running, to learn to suffer and to push yourself to the higher intensity, what kind of skills do you kind of help impart on your athletes for that? Because it is it's a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Or are you just?
I think this is the part that plays. No. I mean, this is where when you have people who are really mentally challenged by the idea, they go out and you have them run long. And I don't have a problem with that. I had athletes do that all the time that would be freaking out because they're so used to going long and they hadn't gone long. And so we go and let them go do a long run, and they come back and they're like, oh, I feel better. Okay. I feel like I can do this. That's just part of the the kind of the illusion or the fairy tale that we like to tell ourselves about things. And so, it's because people bought into this. I've just got to go spend time on my feet.
Right.
I've just got to go out there. And,
what about your feet? My feet hurt when I don't. Do you just go suffer through the blisters? Like, how do you get through that part of the long run?
I don't get blisters. And blisters are quick. a quick understanding of blisters are your shoes don't actually fit. Or you're rubbing your toes, or you're making mechanical errors.
Or all of the above.
Yeah, or all of the above. And so, like, I ran in pretty low profile shoes, and I'm barefoot most of the day. It just is what it is. And you can choose to be in a padded shoe and make that much worse on yourself. And here's that illusion again. If I wear shoes, I'm protecting my feet, and I'm walking around, I'm going to be fine because then I can wear padded shoes in a race. Well, the irony of that is that the more padding you have on your foot, the harder you're going to slam your foot into the ground.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that makes sense because you're not. Yeah, because if you don't have a lot of padding, you're not going to land as hard.
I picked up on this at my first ultra marathon race where there was some Indian guys who were running, legit Indians from like Mexico, who were running in the race in sandals. And there was a guy by the name of Barefoot Ted who was he was basically barefoot most of the time. And I still know him today. And they were the quietest people, and they were walking around normal, and everybody else was crippled walking around after the race. Yeah.
So how do you learn to transition from the super padded shoe and the bad mechanics? I mean, what are like three drills or three things that you start with for someone like me?
Yeah, get out of your shoes more often. Start stretching your feet more or mobilizing your feet more. And I would get a pair of low profile shoes that you can transition in and out of. Meaning if I go do, I'm gonna like start wearing those shoes to walk around in, to get used to, then start to do some of your running in them, then start to do the majority of your running in them, and then go back to your other shoes. Right. And so make these transitions like that. But you've got to, I mean, this is in part why utilizing a program like CrossFit is actually kind of, important, or actually doing drill work barefoot, starting to run after your workouts, like a lot of the stuff we'll have athletes do is go run in the grass barefoot after they train, right? This starts to develop that whole sensory. You've got hundreds of thousands of sensors in the bottoms of your feet that you're not even using when you've got shoes on.
Right.
And so when we start to use those things, we start to make corrections. And it's just a feedback system. Plus, you're grounding yourself like to the planet to a large degree, which is a very important thing, actually. And being in shoes all the time is has presented a problem, especially shoes that have artificial lifts in them where they're not zeroed out, like meaning just flat all the way across. Mm-hmm. Like women's high heel shoes are probably the worst things that were ever invented. It destroys women's ankles.
Yeah, I would believe it. I practiced law for 13 years and I haven't worn heels since. And my body's much happier.
Well, it's like wearing, it's also like, it's like wearing Olympic weightlifting shoes around all day. Like I see powerlifters, we saw this switch about 5 or 6 years ago where powerlifters started grasping the idea of squatting in Olympic weightlifting shoes. And then we started seeing a lot of issues that were occurring as a result of that, because you're in a heel lift and it makes it easier and you don't have to use your hips as much, right? Because you can get down deeper because dorsiflexion's taken. It's just a mechanical advantage thing, right? And all of a sudden when you're in normal shoes, you can't move as well now. Yeah.
That's interesting. Interesting. So like, you recommend squatting in like a normal shoe if you're doing...
I squat, I lift barefoot.
Yeah. And that's hard for me. Like coming from Olympic weightlifting to even consider doing like
I would not Olympic weightlift with that. I would Olympic weightlift in Olympic weightlifting shoes. I think they're specifically, Olympic weightlifting, totally different. Squatting, deadlifting, pressing. If you're doing those things, you don't need shoes. You literally legitimately do not need shoes on.
It freaks me out to not be in shoes because of just like the danger. I'm like, oh, the bar, the black toe. But I guess if you just don't drop the bar on your feet.
What if you had a shoe on and the bar dropped on it?
Yeah, it's true. It's really not that much more protection.
No, it's not.
I think the shoe debate's so interesting because like I've been wearing the cross trainers for the last year and I haven't been doing that much running, and then I go to do this race last weekend and I put on my old stability running shoes, and they're not like too stable, but they're definitely a stability shoe, and I was out of sorts because I have not been wearing those crazy shoes, and so I think I can make the transition now because I've given myself time without even realizing it.
Yeah, that's making some changes, adaptation.
Not even knowing I was doing it. So let's talk about, I've been following you on Instagram for a while, and you do a lot with breath work.
Yes.
So let's talk about that.
Yes.
Breathing. I suck at breathing too, Brian. So
well, most athletes do. Most endurance athletes do. Most athletes in general do. We just think it's just this thing that we do, and I did, and was kind of proven wrong when I started looking at this in the way that, like maybe the free diving community looked at it, the yoga community looked at it. You're looking, there's many different methods out there. There's many different things out there. There's traditions that are thousands of years old, and we've really just not paid a whole lot of attention to this. And because something was a part of some hippy dippy esoteric, program that wasn't really that attractive to us, or we just felt like this was just our stretching class, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a reason why breath is attached to a practice like yoga. And, there are things you can take from that that we have learned, that we have learned to extrapolate the principles of these things and start to integrate them into the work we're doing within our own training paradigm. And by that, I mean like introducing something like, well, for the next month, you're only going to nasal breathe when you're running. And even if you're doing 200 or 400 meter repeats or 800 meter repeats, you're just nasal breathing. And that changes somebody's that'll change somebody's world pretty quickly.
I guess so.
Yeah, and it limits your ability to do a number of things. And one of the things that we have to understand is that the nose was designed with the respiratory system in mind, and the mouth was designed with our communication and our digestive system. And to sit there and run or ride my bike and just open my mouth and breathe, what I'm doing is I'm just offloading a lot of CO2. I'm not taking in any more oxygen than I would in any other situation. But what I am doing is I'm offloading CO2. And when I offload CO2, there's a specific relationship that CO2 has with O2. And it makes oxygen actually bioavailable. And so carbon dioxide levels have to be adequate enough in the bloodstream in order for us to utilize the oxygen effectively. So oxygen binds to red blood cells. Endurance athletes know red blood cells. The more you've got, the more oxygen carrying power you have. But you also need this protein called hemoglobin, which makes the red blood cell like a magnet for oxygen. But unfortunately, that oxygen cannot be kicked off unless there's enough acid in the blood or CO2 to coax it off or get it off. And so when I just breathe with my mouth open or breathe the way I want to, I'm not actually as aerobically or oxygen efficient as I could be. And this is why you see things in like yoga where they nasal breathe into specific positions. They'll inhale into a position, they'll exhale into the next position, and they're breathing through their nose mainly, right? Mm-hmm. So Patrick McEwen did an incredible job of bringing the Buteyko method, which is a Russian method of breathing, to the masses. And the Buteyko method was brought into the Russian medical system to eliminate asthma. And it was the first line of defense for eliminating asthma. And it did a profound job at that. I have, without even trying, helped hundreds of people with asthma because we've got them to transition over to nasal breathing. And what we've found is that people who have low CO2 tolerance levels are not very good at utilizing oxygen. And so we train them to develop a higher level of CO2 tolerance in the lungs, which inevitably allows them to slow down the respiration rate. So the easy play with that is we get people to start nasal breathing. The more complex play with that is there's specific speeds at which you can use your breathing pattern in order to gear up or gear down. And then this could transition even into mouth breathing, where mouth breathing becomes a necessity. But the three-phase process with breathing and respiration is that it is a mechanical advantage, it is a physiological advantage, and it is a mental or state advantage. And when I say that, I mean that when we actually alter the breathing, it affects mechanics, physiology, and state.
I find myself breathing differently just talking to you about breathing. I bet everyone that's listening later is going to be like, I know. I was like, oh gosh, I'm a mouth breather.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is why when you do a podcast or you talk for a while, you're gonna feel a little energy drop, is because you're actually blowing off CO2. So you're actually stressing yourself out more. You're more sympathetic dominant when you actually open your mouth. And if I'm more sympathetic dominant, it's harder for me to transition back into parasympathetic, right? So if I'm actually training my athletes to utilize nasal breathing in the first month of their training, I'm actually conditioning them to be much more aerobically efficient. And we see massive changes from people who didn't know, that had no idea of how they were breathing or what they were doing. And that alone changes an athlete's career or a person's life, because they actually, and how important is this? Well, are your mitochondria important? And
yes.
Yeah, they are.
I need those.
And yet you could have an athlete who, trains really hard every day, but is a mouth breather, and they're not using that mitochondria to a very high level because they're so sympathetic dominant. They're actually burning through more of their sugar instead of their fat, or they're not utilizing oxygen as well. And so you don't need to go work out hard in order to do that. You can just open your mouth and offload a whole bunch of CO2.
Yeah.
And you'll do that.
So I had a car accident a couple years ago and had been just going to this ART practitioner for years, like trying to get my neck and back to just quit hurting. It hurt all the time, no matter what I did. And he finally just said, we're going to do a session with breathing. And I got so mad because I thought, you're not fixing me. Nothing is working. And we went through I was just breathing through my mouth. I was breathing so inefficiently. And over the last year and a half, my neck and my back have stopped hurting. I mean, they hurt from training, but the major pain I was having is gone. And I'm like, well, really? Breathing? I mean, I guess, yogis have known this forever, but yeah, I totally believe it.
Yeah. BKS Iyengar, the quote that he basically said was, the brain or the mind is the king of the senses, and the breath is the king of the mind. Mm-hmm. And so you control that breath. You control that breath. You actually can control what's going on in the body's reaction to things.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. So how can people learn about power, speed, endurance and kind of what you guys do?
Yeah, we actually do a lot. It's not just like endurance training. It's actually full gamut training with, like, hey, if you're a runner, like it still involves breath work. There's breath work that comes with that, how to breathe, what's working with that. There's mobility work. There's obviously the strength and conditioning aspect or the movement side of things. We've encompassed everything basically that kind of I've been going over here into one platform. And we've just launched our app, which houses all this information where you have your training in your hand, you have the breathing stuff in your hand. So we've got a breathing timer in there that you can input your breathing protocols into, whether you're going to be using them when you're working. So let's just say I have you doing we might have somebody do a 3-second inhale, 3-second exhale, and they're going to run or they're going to ride their bike as hard as they can while still doing that, right? So you can have that running at the same time, or before a workout or after workout, you want to down regulate or get more parasympathetic or recover quicker. You input that stuff into the breathing side of things and you go through that. The training's there, all of the information's there. We have a ton of information on the website that's actually for free, and just gives an outline and gives an overview, including research, resources, etc., on everything that we do.
And what's the website? Powerspeedendurance.com?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, cool. One more question, Brian.
Yeah.
This podcast is called The Same 24 Hours, meaning we all have the same 24 hours in our day, but it's what we do with those 24 hours that leads to our greater health, happiness, and success. So what is something that you do on a daily basis that makes your life better?
I actually have a formal breathing and meditation practice.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, I move. This is kind of a compound answer. I do breath work. I meditate inside that structure or outside of that. I actually do yoga basically daily, and I move in another form of whether I'm on my bike, I'm running, or I'm training in the gym. These are the things I do. This is what I do in order to feel my best. And I may even get in my sauna or my cold tank, right? And those are all things that I implement in my life because they all have a very, very positive impact on my life.
So how long is what? I said one question. I lied.
Mm-hmm.
One more.
Yeah.
How long? A lot of times with the breath work and yoga, people say I don't have time, which BS to that. But
yeah.
How long do you meditate and do yoga?
It all depends. It all depends. Yeah. My breath work and meditation is sometimes just less than 10 minutes.
Okay.
Other times it can be upwards of 30 minutes.
Okay. So you can do it in any time you have.
Whatever you got.
Anytime you make.
Breathing is actually a form of meditation.
Yeah.
So just doing some breathing for 5 to 10 minutes will actually it'll literally alter your physiology.
Well, thank you, Brian. This was wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.